Hello and welcome back to An Old Man Watches, and today I'm going to be talking about the first two Starship Troopers sequels, 2004's Hero of the Federation and 2008's Marauder. Hero of the Federation takes us to a new alien planet where a group of troopers are surrounded by armies of bugs. Said troopers deliver heavy-handed exposition mingled with equally heavy-handed cliches to establish the cardboard stereotypes that they're going to play in this film. We have the hapless rookie, the tough-as-nails commander, the no-nonsense sergeant, the overcompensating junior officer, the big African-American with an equally big gun, and so on. Now, some of these archetypes buy it in the ensuing battle, but most of them manage to break out and flee to a supposedly abandoned facility that they feel they may be able to defend long enough to get evacuated. There, they discover that the base is not quite so abandoned as they thought. There's a man locked in the facility's incinerator. This is a Captain Dax, who murdered the base's commanding officer. He's going to be your weary hero who has lost his faith for the movie. The troopers are confused by Dax's cynicism, but cheered by having a defensible base and an experienced new leader. Their chances of holding off waves of warrior bugs seem much better now, but it gradually begins to emerge that the enemy are far more insidious than anyone previously knew. In Marauder, meanwhile, the battlefield war with the bugs continues. Supreme command of Earth's forces now rests with Sky Marshal Anoki, a balding middle-aged guy who also somehow manages to be a sex symbol pop star. John Rico, meanwhile, who was completely absent from the previous film, is now a colonel, commanding a military outpost on a frontline planet. When his base is visited by Sky Marshal Anoki, everything goes to heck. The base is overrun, and while the Sky Marshal is successfully evacuated, his ship is damaged and he ends up marooned on a planet far behind enemy lines. To make matters worse, powerful factions within the human military seem to have very little interest in rescuing him. They'd apparently rather just execute Rico for alleged incompetence and wash the hands of the Sky Marshal completely. Can Rico get his neck out of the hangman's noose and save the day? Right, so how are these two movies? Well, they're not great, to be honest. But then there were plenty of warning signs that they wouldn't be. What signs, you say? Well, rhetorically speaking, I'm glad you asked. So number one, they're direct-to-home video, or as such films sometimes tried to bill themselves back in the late 90s and early 90s, exclusive to video. I'm not sure who they thought they were fooling. Number two, they come out after a suspiciously long gap, suggesting that either this is a belated attempt to cash in, or they've slapped the franchise name on an original script in the hope of making it more saleable. Number three, none of the original cast return. Now, admittedly, Starship Troopers did itself no favours there by killing off most of its most talented cast members. But if you can't tempt Casper Van Dien to turn up, this is a man whose entire career at the time was pretty much Sci-Fi Channel original movies, then something is almost certainly wrong, and they couldn't get him back for Hero of the Federation, which has all of these danger signs. Marauder at least manages to avoid the third, as Van Diem and his big square jaw do return, and it potentially avoids the second. It came out only 4 years after Hero of the Federation. And it feels more like a script that was deliberately written as a Starship Troopers property, rather than something that could have simply been repurposed. Now, this is not to say that Marauder is a good movie, mind you. It makes many mistakes, but it does at least make them in slightly different ways. So one of the things that I liked about the original Starship Troopers was the extent to which it satirised itself. Although filled with lots of surface-level jingoism, tribalism, and oorah militarism, it was a wafer-thin veneer that the movie practically begged the audience to see but beyond. That all of this bombast was, within the reality presented by the film, merely crass propaganda shoveled down the throats of viewers to keep them satiated and amenable to the authorities' demands and agenda. The human media's frequent refrain of, "Would you like to know more?" may as well be, "We'll tell you what to think." Paul Verhoeven's film ultimately makes clear that the society which John Rico and his friends fight and die to protect is, at its core, pretty much as inhuman as that of the bugs. The original film does this through a number of different techniques, the most obvious which is probably the bombastic, over-the-top news reports that are dotted throughout the movie. Now, it seems that this kind of satire isn't as easy as it might look because, despite sharing the same writer as the original, both sequels fail to recapture anything like the same effect. I will say that Marauder fails in a somewhat more entertaining manner, however. You see, Hero of the Federation just jams some lukewarm retreads of those over-the-top news reports in between various segments of the film, without much regard for the fact that this movie doesn't have anywhere near the same bombastic tone as the original. The news reports needed to be restructured to tie into the feel of this film, but they aren't, which means that they don't really work in the context of the movie. Marauder, meanwhile, goes all in on the gonzo, with Sky Marshal Anoki's ridiculous double life as Supreme Military Commander and middle-aged one-man boy band. I found it pretty funny, but I don't think it's satire, it's just goofy absurdity. Both sequels pick up on the original film's theme of the bugs being more intelligent and subtle than the human government expected. They each give the bugs much more insidious and subtle weapons and strategies than the hordes of flesh-chomping warrior bugs we have seen before. These bugs employ a lot of infiltration and subversion tactics in both of the movies. Now, if you were cynical, you might suggest that these lower-key, more stealthy infiltration tactics have the benefit of eliminating the need to depict the aforementioned horde of flesh-chomping warrior bugs. And I certainly think that that cynic, because I am that cynic, has a point. The CGI in both these films is obviously a step below that of the original movie, despite the overall advancement of the technology in the intervening years. I don't think it's any accident that there's a lot less of it in this film, in these films, than there was in the first one. And honestly, I don't blame either film for this decision, given their obviously much smaller resources. Hero of the Federation is frankly at its best, which is still admittedly fairly mediocre, when it is focusing on being a small-scale, paranoia-driven Thing clone, rather than the big-scale Starship Troopers war movie. Meanwhile, the Bugs plan in Marauder is actually quite a clever one, and I love that the film ends with the human government co-opting elements of it for its own purposes. That feels like the cynical satire I liked from the first movie. So, I mean, unless you're really desperate to see more Starship Troopers, you can probably skip these. I'll admit that in the early noughties, I was really desperate to see more Starship Troopers, which is why I have seen them. Next time, the 1974 alleged comedy Throw Up the Anchor. You probably haven't heard of it, and frankly, there's a good reason for that. But that's next time. Until then, thanks for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it.